So today we have Professor Kevin Arrigo. He is the Donald M. Steele Professor in Earth Sciences in the Department of Earth Science, System Science at Stanford University. He is a biological oceanographer who studies the microbial ecology of polar ecosystems to better understand their role in marine food webs, nutrient cycling, and productivity. His research focuses on photosynthetic organisms living in the sea ice and the ocean and how they are able to thrive in such extreme polar conditions. He is particularly interested in how climate-induced changes in polar environments is changing biological productivity and how this might impact marine ecosystems. And today, Professor Arrigo will be talking to us about changes in Arctic Ocean productivity. So thank you.
All right, thank you. So I hope all this works. Yes, I want to be talking about the Arctic today, and so because obviously that's one of the places where changes are very large and widespread. And so just a little background for those of you who may not be that familiar with the Arctic. It's the world's smallest ocean, but it also has the world's largest continental shelf. And so this is a bathymetry map of the Arctic Ocean here. And these light blue areas are essentially continental shelf areas that are around 200 meters deep only. So you see the central basins are really deep, but there's lots and lots of shelves here. It's characterized by really cold surface waters with low nutrients, and these deeper basins tend to have higher nutrients in the deep waters. And so oftentimes it's been considered to be a severely nutrient limited system. It's also a region that's dominated by ice. So sea ice expands and contracts every year. And so it reaches its minimum around September, and it reaches its maximum sometime around March. And it oscillates between those two extremes. Of course, it's also changing over time. And this is sort of the long-term trend in winter sea ice since around 1970. And so from 1970 to around 1950, it was pretty constant. And since 1950, it's been a steady decline that's continued all the way to today. So we're losing sea ice extent at a very rapid rate. We're also losing thickness, and this is what I hope to show. This is an animation, but because I had to turn this into a PDF, I can't show the animation. But what it shows is ice age. And so this is 1984, and I think I have a couple shots later of what it looks like later in the present time. And so what you can see is it's mostly covered by this thick white ice here, which is 3 to 4 years old. And so it's a lot of really thick multi-year ice. But if I was playing this animation, what you would see is a lot of this ice is getting flushed out of the Tram Strait here, and a lot of it melts. And if you looked at one of these images today, what you would see is there's very little of this old thick ice and a whole lot of first-year ice, and that's sort of this light gray. So the multi-year ice is being replaced by first-year ice, which means essentially what has happened is we're losing a lot of the ice extent, but we've also lost 75% of the ice volume. And so lots of ice loss. There's a variety of reasons for this. One, simply there's warmer waters that are coming into the Arctic Ocean that are melting the ice. They're coming in from the Pacific, and they're also coming in from the Atlantic side. That's causing ice to melt. There's atmospheric circulation patterns that actually favor the flushing of ice out of the Arctic Ocean. And so this is the Arctic Oscillation. And the Arctic Oscillation is basically looking at the pressure difference between atmosphere over the Arctic and at mid-latitudes. And when you've got high pressure in the Arctic and lower pressure at mid-latitudes, it sets up this wind pattern that just drives ice out of the Arctic Ocean. This was at its peak in the early 1990s when we were flushing a lot of thick multi-year ice. It's declined since then, but the ice is still disappearing. So obviously, this is not the only thing causing the decline in sea ice. We've also got increased temperatures due to greenhouse warming. So the air temperatures have increased dramatically. This is the difference from the mean. So this is a anomaly plot of air temperatures, and it's gone up, roughly 5-6 degrees C since 1979-2001 mean. So atmospheric temperatures are going up too. So you put all these three things together, and what's actually happening is it's set up this situation where we've got this very strong ice albedo feedback. And ice albedo feedback essentially is what's been keeping the Arctic cold for so long. Because it's covered in ice, solar radiation bounces off the ice back into space, and it doesn't heat the water, right? Which keeps it cold. But as you start to lose ice, you start to open up more of the surface waters, and those surface waters absorb a lot more heat. The ocean warms up, it makes it harder to form ice the next year. So you have less ice, more open water, and the thing repeats. And essentially what you end up with is no ice in the Arctic. And that's probably where we're headed and I say no ice in the Arctic, that's in the summer. We're probably headed there at around 2050. We can expect that there will no longer be sea ice in the summertime in the Arctic. All right. I'm not a sea ice person, I'm a phytoplankton ecologist person. So my interest in this is, given the fact that we're losing so much sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, how has the productivity of this system changed? And how might it change in the future? So what can we say about those two big questions? Oops. Before we get there, just for those of you who are not phytoplankton ecologists, what is primary production? I'm going to use the term primary production a lot. And primary production is really, it's just the photosynthetic uptake of carbon by these little guys that you see on the screen here. These are mostly diatoms, and diatoms pretty much dominate the Arctic, both in the ice and in the water column. These things, they photosynthesize, they make food. That food is then available for the entire ecosystem. So these things are really important. They're important biogeochemically, they're important biologically. So there's two competing hypotheses about what might happen to the Arctic Ocean as this sea ice continues to melt. One talks about the fact that we've got a lot of melting ice, we've got increased precipitation. So what that's doing is it's putting a lot of fresh water into the surface waters of the Arctic Ocean. And if you put fresh water at the surface of the Arctic Ocean, what it does is it really stratifies the layers. So you got this dense water down below, you got this fresh water up above, and it's really hard to mix between them. And so I said earlier, it's sort of a nutrient limited system. And so if you can't get nutrients from the deep water into the surface waters, productivity is going to decline. And this has sort of been the conventional wisdom that the Arctic is going to get less productive as time goes on, as this stratification intensifies, making it harder for nutrients to get into the surface water where phytoplankton can actually utilize them. So that's one possible hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that, well, because we're losing all this ice now, the surface waters are now exposed to the wind, and the wind can mix those nutrients from the deep water to the surface. And in that case, you might have higher productivity. So there's a debate going on which of those hypotheses is likely to win out in the future. And that's one of the things we're going to focus on. That's at least what I think is going to happen. So what I want to know is, can recent changes in phytoplankton biomass and their productivity shed light on which one of these future scenarios is more likely? And so what we did was we have quantified net primary production throughout the Arctic Ocean between 1998 and 2020. And we've also looked at the potential causes for any changes that we can see, and I'll describe those in a little bit. The Arctic is a really difficult place to sample. You know, it's difficult to get ships in there. And so what the tools we have to use, the best tools we have to use are actually satellites. And so satellites can measure a lot of the things that we need to measure to look at how productivity in the Arctic is actually changing. And so we've got MODIS measures the color of the ocean, it measures the temperature of the ocean. CWIS measures the color of the ocean. AVHR measures the temperature of the ocean. SSMI measures how much ice there is. So we can look at how much open water there is, how warm the water is, and how much phytoplankton are there, just using satellites. And so we can produce maps like this. So this is a map of sea ice, sea surface temperature. This is a map of chlorophyll concentration, which essentially tells us how much phytoplankton are there. We can put this together along with similar maps of sea ice cover, and an algorithm which we've developed for the Arctic to calculate productivity throughout the Arctic every single day. And we can add all these together every day, get productivity for every year throughout the whole Arctic, and look at how that's changing over time. So that's essentially what we've done. We published on this in 2015, and what we noticed then was that this is open water area. So as sea ice is declining, obviously open water area is getting more abundant, right? We're losing ice, so there's more ice-free open water. Right, so open water area is going up. As open water area goes up, whoops, I went the long way. As open water area goes up, productivity of the Arctic Ocean also went up. This is in teragrams carbon per year. So this is the productivity across the whole Arctic Ocean over a year. And it increased 30 to 40% between 1998 and this study had to stop at 2012, which is a huge increase. 30 to 40% production increase in an ocean basin is unprecedented. No ocean basin has ever seen a change in production this big before. So it was a large change. And it was due to the fact that you've got a lot more open water area. So you can sort of think of it as, you know, if you were thinking along agricultural lines, right? More open water area is like having more land to plant your crops, right? You got more acreage, you're going to get more production. You're going to produce more crops if you've got more acreage. What also is happening, though, at the same time is that the length of time that that water is open has also increased. And it's increased from like 250 days from 80 days to almost 160 days. So almost 2-month increase in how long the water stays open. And that's sort of like, you think of agriculture again, the growing season. How long is your growing season? So now we can maybe plant multiple crops. And so these two together result in much higher rates of production in recent years as opposed to back in 1998. So we think we understand the causes there. What happened though, that study stopped in 2012. 2012, it turns out, is the year with the lowest sea ice cover on record. And so it reached its minimum then. But we wanted to know, all right, what's happened since 2012? And so this is that open water area from 1998 to 2012. If you look at 2012, there's been really no change in ice cover at all since 2012. It's really stayed pretty much static. And so one might predict, all right, well, if this is due to increases in open water area, it's very likely that productivity probably hasn't increased either since 2012. But when you look at production, in fact, it has increased another 24% since 2012. And over this whole time series now, it's a 57% increase. So even though we don't have any more open water, we have a lot more productivity still. So something else is going on that's driving this production. So why is this production continue to increase? Well, the other thing we looked at was how much phytoplankton are actually there. And so when we look for the first part from 1998 to 2012, there was really no change in the amount of chlorophyll concentration, how much phytoplankton were there. It stayed really constant for that whole time. Since 2012, though, it's increased 31%. So what has happened now is we've got this big increase in the amount of phytoplankton in the Arctic. So the growing season hasn't changed, but now what's happened is the amount of phytoplankton have changed, and that's what's driving that increase in productivity. The question is why? Why all of a sudden is productivity going up? Well, it seems like what's happened is we've sort of reached some sort of threshold in the Arctic where two things have increased. So the only way you get more phytoplankton biomass is to give them more nutrients. And there's two ways to do that. One is through advection. So nutrients can come in from the Pacific, it can come in from the Atlantic. That can help drive increased production, or you can have increased vertical mixing. So bringing nutrients from those deep waters up to the surface. That can also drive increases in phytoplankton biomass. And so what we can do is we can use the satellite data to try to see if we can tease out those effects. And so this is a map of the rate of change in chlorophyll concentration between 1998 and 2018. And so areas in red are areas where chlorophyll has gone up significantly. Areas in blue are areas where chlorophyll concentrations have gone down. And what you can see is the biggest increases in chlorophyll are right here in the Barents Sea and right here in the Chukchi Sea. And those are the two inflow shelves of the Arctic Ocean. That is where water comes from the Atlantic and the Pacific into the Arctic Ocean. And so it looks like advection of water is increasing nutrient supply to these areas. And it's been documented that the advection has increased. In fact, it's increased 50% in the Chukchi Sea, not quite as large in the in the Barents Sea, but advection is clearly playing a role. In addition to that, though, we can see there's also increases right here. This gray line is the shelf break, so that's the boundary between that deep basin that I showed you before and the shallow continental shelves, which are here. And you can see right at the shelf break, right where it transitions from shallow water to deep water, we also get large increases in chlorophyll there, large increase in chlorophyll there, large increases in chlorophyll there. And these are areas where the sea ice has recently retreated back, exposing these shelf break areas for the first time, and it's pulling nutrients up to the surface, causing increased productivity here. So it looks like we've got increased mixing and increased advection are both resulting in higher biomass in the Arctic Ocean. So this study we published in 2020, it only went to 2018. So just a quick update. So this is how it looks as of 2018. If we look at the last 2 years, we can see the last 2 years have actually been the most productive on record still. So we're still on this upward trend. It's still becoming more and more productive. If we look, what we can see is now it's two things are happening. We're getting a little bit more open water. So part of that production can be attributed to slightly increases in open water area. But more importantly, the chlorophyll concentrations are continuing to go up. So these processes that are bringing more nutrients into the Arctic Ocean are continuing still. Okay, so the conclusions of that part. So for most of the last 20 years, the loss of ice is controlling how much productivity was in the Arctic Ocean. More open water area, longer growing season led to higher productivity. But since around 2012, increases in phytoplankton biomass have now driven the upward trend in productivity. And this is most likely due to greater nutrient supplies, although we need field studies to look at this. You can't really tell, you can't see this from satellites, but we can see the effects from satellites in the patterns and where chlorophyll is going up. And this whole together supports the idea, there was those two competing hypotheses. This sort of supports the hypothesis that as sea ice continues to decline, that the Arctic Ocean is going to become more productive due to increased mixing, bringing nutrients to the surface, and not less productive, as some people had predicted. So just a few slides on under ice blooms. That's another big area of interest for me. So everything I've told you about is productivity that we can measure from satellite. So it's all going on in open water. The issue is now what we've realized is that there is a lot of productivity going on under the ice that we cannot see in a satellite. And this was reported big time for the first time in a paper we wrote in 2012 based on this study, which was called ICESCAPE. And essentially we sampled along this transect here. This gray area is ice. This black area is open water. And so we went from open water into the ice, and then we came back out of the ice again. This is our fluorometer data from that same thing. And what you can see is that there's very low chlorophyll concentrations. So this is chlorophyll here. Chlorophyll concentrations, once we got onto the ice, got really high, and then they went down again. I'll just show you what that looks like. So this is a cutaway view. So this is a section plot of, let me go up there, of this transect right here. So we look at this transect in detail. Here it is on the side view. This is the ice concentration. So this is 100% ice right here. This is no ice. So this is area, there's no ice, very low chlorophyll concentrations. We got some deep values here, but there's this enormous phytoplankton bloom right here. So this is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with phytoplankton. These chlorophyll concentrations, they're almost 30 micrograms per liter, which is incredibly high. And it's like 10 micrograms per liter all the way down to 70 meters. So this is incredibly intense bloom of phytoplankton under 100% ice cover. And the chart you see, this ice was about roughly a meter thick. This is what it looked like with a camera. So this is an area where there was no under ice bloom. This is an area with under ice bloom. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face hardly. It was so thick with phytoplankton. When we compare the phytoplankton concentrations we measured in that bloom to a global compilation of chlorophyll concentrations all over the world, the average global concentration is about 46, and the maximum we measured was almost 1,300, and the mean was 840. So this is a big phytoplankton bloom. It was very productive. It averaged about, this is just the production up until we stopped sampling. So up to 150 grams carbon per meter squared, which is really high rates of production for polar waters. The average is around 80. So the question is, how is it possible? How is it possible to have that much production under a meter to a meter and a half of sea ice? Well, this is what sea ice in the Arctic used to look like. This is what sea ice in the Arctic looks like today. And it's almost all first year ice, as I said, and it's covered in melt ponds. These melt ponds transmit lots of light. We, on that cruise, we actually happened to be having a whole optical team, so we were measuring the heck out of the light transition through this. And what we found is that these areas here, where it's not white, was transmitting about 55% of the incident radiance or incident light down to the water below. And so there was plenty of light under this kind of ice to allow phytoplankton to grow. What we're curious to know, so this was discovered here, right there in the Chukchi Sea. Since then, what we've done is we've looked around and people are starting to look for under ice blooms. And these are all the places where there's evidence where under ice blooms have now been reported. So they're all over the Arctic Ocean. This is a map of this is what I told you. This is what multi-year ice looks like in 2016. So there's a lot less multi-year ice than there used to be. All these areas you'll see, though, are in first-year ice. This is that light gray here. They're all first-year ice. If you look back in 1984, though, most of these areas would have been in thick multi-year ice. If it was multi-year ice, you would not have under ice blooms. So under ice blooms are very likely to be a recent phenomenon. So what does this all mean? Putting it all together, Arctic productivity is increasing. It's increasing dramatically in both the ice-free ocean and in the ice-covered ocean. It's still too soon to know exactly what the ecological impacts of this increase is, but it's likely to be important. We need to start accounting for this under ice productivity. This is a satellite map of the productivity that we measured our under ice bloom. According to the satellite, there's only 5 grams of carbon per meter squared per year produced here in open water. During the under ice bloom, it was 80 to 150 grams of carbon. So the satellite is missing all that carbon. So we need to find a way to account for that somehow. This is one of the most worrying things for me, is that the productivity is shifting much earlier in the year now. And there's many animals that migrate to the Arctic to be there when productivity is at its peak. And when productivity is peaking months earlier, that's going to potentially pose a problem for these migrants. And finally, sort of bit of good news, a more productive Arctic also means that the Arctic is going to be taking up more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is a good thing, and providing that for food for the ecosystems, although it's likely to result in changes in ecosystems. It's going to be a small extra sink because the Arctic Ocean isn't that big. On a global scale, it's only a small fraction of total productivity, but it's something. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise your hand button or type in the chat box.
Should I stop sharing?
It might be good to keep the slides up in case you need to refer to any of them.
All right.
All right, I see a question from Shane. Go ahead.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you very much for this presentation. I learned a lot today, but unfortunately your microphone went off right at the time where you were discussing the impact of the contour of the continental shelf on the map of productivity. Would you mind just telling again what was your conclusion from that?
From which now?
So you showed a slide where you showed a map of primary productivity with the contour of the continental shelf.
Geez, yeah,
and I think you related the pattern to that shelf. And so I couldn't hear what you said about, what are the implications of that observation?
Yeah, so let me see if I can get. So here you're talking about. Whoops.
Yes. What was your overall conclusion?
Yeah, so I had talked about advection being important. So nutrients are coming in, and that's what's stimulating production here. But there's also this area right here. So this is the boundary between, this is deep water here, and this is very shallow water here, right? And so this is the shelf break. And what it looks like is that, and this is the shelf break, and this is the shelf break. So this is where the deep water is now This has been exposed to ice for the first time. I mean, in a long time, or exposed to the air for the first time in a long time. So winds are now blowing on this, mixing nutrients to the surface. And so we're getting these big blooms of phytoplankton in deep waters where we normally don't see big blooms of phytoplankton. So this is good evidence that increased mixing is happening, bringing nutrients to the surface and stimulating blooms. It's not just advection, it's also mixing. That was my main point there.
Right, or upwelling along the continental shelf, basically, the shelf break,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, along the shelf
Okay,
break.
thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take a question from Dimitri before jumping into the chat box and then going back to those who raised their hands. So Dimitri, go ahead.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. You probably answered a little bit to the question that I'm going to ask. I'll ask it anyway. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that high melt rate of sea ice results in a high stratification, which means stronger stability in a water column,
Right.
which results in the lower nutrient supply to the upper ocean. At the same time, we see increase of the primary productivity. What is driving the nutrient supply to the upper ocean? Is it advection only?
Oh no, so I think let me go up to it. So I gave the two competing hypotheses. So I think it's this. So the first one I presented was this. So there's one possibility is that, like you said, stratification is going to prevent nutrients from coming to the surface. But I think that's not happening. I think like in those shelf break areas that have now where the ice has retreated back, that now we've got winds blowing on those surface waters that are resulting in mixing coming up and increased upwelling along the shelf break. That's what it looks like. That's what the patterns of chlorophyll suggest, that this process, advection is important in some places, but this is important in other places.
I see. So mechanically driven mixing, it overcomes the stratification.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Because a lot of people have thought that that couldn't happen, that stratification was just too strong and no amount of wind mixing was going to break it down. But it looks like, at least in some places, that it is, because that's the only way you can explain increased chlorophyll at the shelf break.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Right, I'm looking at my clock, Kevin. It's 12:30. Do you have a couple more minutes to take the
Oh,
two
yeah.
questions to see online? Okay, great. Thank you. So a question from Allison Gray. She says, fantastic talk. Is there any evidence for changes in phytoplankton community structure? If so, could that be impacting the satellite determined records?
Oh, well, there's very little evidence. So in the only real change in community composition that people are talking much about is in areas where nutrients are low. So in this type of situation where you've got this, in the Canada Basin, for example, as nutrients run out, what you end up with is a shift from diatoms, which are these guys are diatoms, right? And so you got to shift from diatoms to really, so it'd be like these little tiny guys here, right? But there's no evidence that there's a large scale shift from diatoms to these little smaller plankton. It happens seasonally a lot, right? At the beginning of the year, you got the big diatoms. By summertime, nutrients have run out and the diatoms fade away, and then the little guys take over. So there's that shift. But large scale, there's no evidence for that. And if there were, the satellite sees them both equally well. And so what the satellite is seeing is concentrations. Since all these types of phytoplankton absorb light in exactly the same, I shouldn't say exactly, pretty much exactly the same way, that a change in composition would not impact our estimates of chlorophyll concentration or productivity. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And then a final question from Monique. Go ahead, Monique.
Thanks, Jenny. That was really interesting. Thank you. I was finding the Bloom Under Ice story to be fascinating, and maybe you said it, but I didn't catch it. You were showing that there was a lot more of a bloom under the ice and none just outside. And also it looked in one of your plots that the nitrate was a lot higher under the ice. And so I was wondering, that must be a nutrient story that makes it bloom under the ice and not outside. And so where does the nutrient come from?
Yeah, normally when I give this talk, I have more than 20 minutes. And so I had to cut some stuff out, and the nutrient story is what I cut out. There is nutrients here, and I didn't even talk about this nitrate. So what's actually happening here is ice is retreating this direction, right? And so it's moving, and it's moving about 10 kilometers a day. This here is actually an old under ice bloom that has descended. There was a bloom under the ice here that has totally disappeared. So it was much earlier. And we can tell that because there's no longer any nitrate here. What we did the year after this cruise is we went back to see, because this was in the summertime when we measured this, and it's like, all right, there's no nitrate in surface waters. So our question was, well, is there ever any nitrate in surface waters? And what we did is we went back to this exact same spot in May and saw this whole area is just full of nutrients in May. And so these nutrients had to have been consumed prior to our arrival there. And prior to our arrival there, this was covered in ice. And so even though there's no ice there now, there was ice there a week before. And so this is just sort of the most recent incarnation of that under ice bloom. But this is a slightly older under ice bloom, and this is an older still under ice bloom. So that whole shelf area there, the major production is happening under the ice. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I told you that was the final question, but we do have one more that popped up. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, question from Aaron Levine. Just to follow up after Allison's question, do satellites have an issue detecting chlorophyll through ice? And if so, is there a role for autonomous vehicles measuring chlorophyll in these areas?
Yes. Well, yes, and satellites cannot measure chlorophyll under ice. And we were actually hoping that, let's see if I showed it in this. When I was hoping that maybe that there's light coming up from under the ice, through the ice, that the satellite might be able to see an under ice bloom, but we looked and you can't see. There's a lot of light being transmitted down, but not enough light being transmitted back up again to be seen by a satellite. So we can't see it. So we do need some sort of autonomous vehicles, and those can be, floats are difficult. Gliders are difficult. A lot of these things are difficult when you've got a continental shelf that averages 50 meters. Many of these things don't work, and even moorings are a problem. So we need to work on different ways. So there's some drifting, like camera. Victoria Hill deployed a floating camera that caught these under ice blooms really well in the Chukchi Sea. And so I think there's a lot of potential here to develop instruments that would allow us to measure what's happening under the ice. Because if we can't do that, we're missing in many areas of the ocean a huge fraction of that productivity.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I think that'll wrap up today's webinar. So thank you so much again, Kevin, for giving the presentation.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.